The Honorable the Vice President.
Senator Henry.
Thank you, Honorable Vice President, for allowing me to join this debate here today on what the Minister described essentially as some basic measures in terms of transferring funds from one heading to another. But as we all know, of course, there's a wider context in which this simple bill operates, and that is in terms of the overall problems and the issues facing our economy. Now, I would like to pick up to some extent where Senator Small left off when he talked about the potential problems going on with the energy sector and oil prices, and to cover to some extent the external threats facing our economy before I say a few words on the domestic situation and what we are really dealing with. Now, there are two potential international threats that the Trinidad and Tobago economy faces over the next 12 to 24 months that the population should be aware of. All right? And that will have a direct or could have a significant consequences for our economic fortunes. I will break them up into two items, primarily for one dealing with the, two global issues. The potential for global economic instability is real and is present. When you look at the crisis that is potentially developing in Europe, with, not only the refugee crisis, but the potential for European economic stability in terms of instability, in terms of a Brexit, as they call it, a British exit from the EU proper. And there's a looming issue of another crisis developing in Greece by this summer. So there's significant concerns in the global economy that this could have a ripple effect and damage already fragile international economic growth. Also, the problems that are mounting continue to mount in China and in America in particular, with problems of deflation in Japan and Europe and America continuing unabated, which is basically the problem of falling prices and weak consumer demand. As we know, over the years, and especially in the last 5 to 6 years, China was the engine of international economic growth. And there's been a slowdown in the Chinese growth rate, which has affected a lot of emerging economies as well. So, in terms of the overall economic outlook for the globe, it's not a pretty picture. And we could suffer the consequences of the possibility of another financial crisis hitting us. I've been warning about this, well, not only me, but many others in the international financial system, and commentators abound have been talking about the possibility of a global financial crisis once again. So this, and we all know what happened in 2000, 2007, 2008 into 2009, and we are in no better position to withstand that kind of crisis today than we were in 2008, 2009. In fact, we are considerably worst off. Thanks in no small measure to the past government over the 5-year period 2010 to 2015. All right? Yeah, but you left a mess. And so, in no small measure, due to the irresponsibility, the reckless mismanagement that we just came out of between 2010 and September 2015. No, we could say it 1,000 times. It's true. Right? So that's one problem with the global financial crisis that could possibly hit, because the real issue, Mr. Vice President, is that there's really no solution to the original financial crisis in 2008, 2009, was really unresolved. What the major powers that be in the US and in Europe, they basically passed the problem forward. They kicked the can down the road, as some would say. And they engage in a kind of quantitative easing, basically printing money to cover up the wound rather than heal the wound. So things seem to be emerging, and growth seemed to have been restored in the US and so on because of the quantitative easing measures. Right? But really, the underlying problems within the financial markets remain unresolved. So many, including significant international commentators, have been warning about a meltdown sometime soon. And again, because they have been able to invent policies to hold it off, all appears to be well. So that's the kind of situation that we're facing in terms of the overall global economy. Again, that issue separate from and apart from the potential crisis in the energy sector that we see it. And we are seeing no real end to the problem of low energy prices anytime soon. And the international opinion varies very widely on this. Every other day you pick up a paper or you read a website like oilprice.com, Bloomberg, and other business media. One day they tell you, well, the oil price could pick back up by the end of the year. And the next day they tell you, no, it will go on for 2 years. Sometimes it's the same author. So we really don't know. We're in a very significant period of uncertainty in terms of oil price and energy prices going forward. Right? You could read as much as you want. You read 10 articles, you read 15, you still end up in the same position. No one really knows. Right? No one, because you, in the same day on the same site, you see two different opinions. And each sounding good. Okay? So each one sounding very, very, very articulate, very well reasoned, and they're saying the opposite things. So this is what we're facing in the world today. So the combination of continued energy problems, we know, as Senator Small said, that OPEC is meeting soon, and there's some hope that they could come to an agreement on production cuts, which would boost the price of oil and natural gas eventually. But many people are saying that is not going to work. They're going to just meet and argue among themselves and continue what can be described as the race to the bottom, where each one tries to outproduce the other to get more revenue, and in the process damages their economy and other producers, oil producing nations. So we've seen some initiatives that have been attempted to resolve the situation. I think the Russians seem to be trying to get Saudi Arabia and others on board to control the price of oil outside of the OPEC arrangement. And we hope that for our sake, at least for Trinidad and Tobago, we could be a little bit selfish here and say that, we hope that some of it bears fruit so we could, again, see some brighter days. Because all the talk about diversification of our economy and so on will not happen with low oil prices. Some would say this is the best time to diversify, to try something else, and that might be true. But the problem is, to finance diversification efforts, you need money. And when you're broken, it's a tough time to engage in developing new industries and hitting and hoping. Right? Usually, the time to diversify, or even if you have any chance of achieving some moderate success, is when you're doing well. And speaking of diversification of the economy, I know a lot of people talk about this. And one thing I would like to say is that this country has, contrary to public perception, attempted to diversify beginning back in the 1960s. And the rhetoric that is out there that has become urban legend is basically that we made no attempt to diversify, and that's why we're in this situation. And that is absolutely not true. It's absolute nonsense. In fact, I had a student at the university who came to me and told me she didn't like the PNM because it didn't do enough to diversify the economy. So I said, what did you base that on? And she said, well, that's what people say. I said, no. This is a university. You don't go by what people say. Go back from 1956, come forward and research the issue, and we'll talk. She came back, she ended up doing her master's thesis on the topic with me. She came back and she said, oh my God, I didn't know so many things were done. When you go back to the 60s and the Industrial Development Corporation, all the plans, the 5-year plan, the second 5-year plan, the whole development of the local poultry industry, the screwdriver industry, the car auto assembly, many of us here are old enough to remember them. These were all attempts at diversification. Right? The manufacturing, yes. No, these were all attempts at diversification. And, strangely enough, diversification is not, people talk about it like it's something you could get up and, in the morning and you diversify. The idea behind it is that it is not because we weren't smart or we weren't proactive or not. This is just old talk. This is what they call in Trinidad parlance, rump shop talk. Yeah. When you go back and look at what was attempted, you'll be surprised. It's very difficult because it is hard to pinpoint any country that started off as an oil economy and successfully diversified into anything. It's difficult. Trinidad is probably one of the best countries in terms of efforts to diversify. But yet we hear the rubbish talk all the time. Right? And, look at the Caribbean islands like Barbados, Jamaica, St. Lucia. At one point, they decided they would diversify away from tourism. Back in the 80s, there were initiatives, the Caribbean Basin Initiative, promoted by Ronald Reagan and so on, and CaribCan, and all these trade agreements. And they said, okay, we could get out of tourism and diversify into textiles, right? They all set up textiles. In fact, just set up free trade zones, a lot of, including Jamaica, and it was working for a while, even though the free trade zone products in Jamaica, which were meant for export, they would just put it on the ship in Montego Bay and drive around and sell it in Kingston. So it defeated the whole purpose. But what the real problem was with textiles, the effort to get into textile manufacturing, was the big elephant in the room, China. So China started to change their policies, become capitalists in certain areas, and start exporting textiles. And what you could produce for $1 US, the Chinese could produce it 15 cents. And that killed off the diversification effort in many of the Caribbean islands. Right? But people need to understand this. That is not just a question of having the right smarts and so on. Sometimes global economic developments turn out to work against you, even with the best laid plan. I mean, we had the issue with the steel plant recently. When the PNM government decided to go into steel back in the 70s, and we invested a lot of money in that plant. Part of the problem was that we didn't have the marketing avenues for the production of the steel. From all reports, it wasn't a bad idea. And the steel was of good quality. Right? But if you don't have the markets, you could produce anything you want, you know, if you don't have the market to sell it. One of the reasons why ArcelorMittal would have come in and be able to sell was because they already had the market. And also the reason why it would be difficult to buy it and try to run it unless you have the contracts to supply somewhere with the steel. What are you doing? Right? So so sometimes we tend to exaggerate and not give ourselves credit enough, mainly because of partisan ideas and so on. But really and truly, the country has made some attempt to diversify and to get other areas of revenue generation, mainly under the PNM, of course. In the past 5 years, from 2010 to 2015, there were basically no revenue generation measures. And it's something that is a fact that the UNC has to live with. I sat over there, budget after budget, telling their finance ministers, why didn't you come with some idea to generate revenue? And now that the PNM is taking the responsible position of coming up with revenue measures, they're screaming bloody murder, as though a country could run only on expenditure. That was basically the UNC assumption. You wouldn't have any protests. You wouldn't introduce new taxes to remain a kind of bogus popularity. And then, of course, when a responsible government comes in and says, well, no, but you need to pay your taxes. We need to raise revenue somehow, because that's how is the country going to run. You scream bloody murder. The people out there are smarter than that. People know that taxation and revenue generation is an essential part of any government's activity. Right? But they pretended as though there was no tomorrow. So in each year in government, they brought bigger and bigger budgets, and each running a deficit for 5 years straight, with oil prices averaging above $95. And then when they come and play the condemning us, when oil dipped under $30. And we're dealing with $38, $39 now. You know, when you had the chance. And one of the things I heard Senator Mark talk about the Heritage and Stabilization Fund, as though the UNC had some claim on that. I mean, what? Man, anyhow, let me be parliamentary. Yeah. Yes. I mean, there was no national savings under the UNC. There was none. Zero. There was no savings. If you run budget deficits for 5 years in government, there's no savings. So don't talk about the Heritage Stabilization and Stabilization Fund as though you have some allegiance to that. None. So what they did, they borrowed money while running deficits and put in the Heritage and Stabilization Fund. So it's like going to the bank, taking out a loan, putting it in your savings account, and patting yourself on the back for being such a prudent saver. Nonsense. You know? So you're in no position to preach to anybody about the Heritage and Stabilization Fund. Because oil prices average over $90 for 4 of your 5 years in office, and you didn't see the need to add anything significant, in fact, anything to national savings. In fact, you increased the national debt significantly.
Oh, yeah.
Because every budget deficit adds to the national debt.
I'll give it to you.
Every budget deficit. National debt is the accumulation of budget deficits. Yes. Right? And yes, so that is why you can't commit thing. And which is why I made a statement that we are worse off in terms of what could potentially happen in the global economy that could impact us today. We're in a worse position than in 2009 because we had significant buffers. And I'm not talking about reserves and heritage and stabilization. We had national savings, and you left none. When this, so the Minister of Finance in the first year, Honorable Winston Dukaran, Minister at the time, used to talk about the cash balances being run down at the central bank, which was true, but there were cash there to be run down. You left nothing.
2 days.
You see, and this, which is the big difference. I mean, the Honorable Minister mentioned this, that the overdraft was positive and so on. This is what we're talking about. Yeah. So what you did, you left nothing for a rainy day, and maybe because you all predicted that you'd be out of office before the rains came. Sometime in you were really supposed to be out by June, but you cheated and took an extra, 3 months. So, yeah. You should have been gone before. Right. Of the 5 years you stayed in office, you were there 4 years and 300 and I would not engage. No, not at all. That's yes. So basically, what we are doing is damage control and trying to restore some sanity to the governance of the country. And that's the mission we are on after you wrecked it. So don't play pious and talk about going to the people and protest and all kind of nonsense. Yeah, as though your 5 years will be quickly forgotten in terms of what you did, in terms of running up the debt, saving very little, in fact, saving nothing at all, right? And in terms of some of the other issues, in the local economy, of course, every year of the UNC's terrible reign, they created some kind of economic crisis or disaster for the country out of thin air. Sometimes there was no reason, some own goal. Like in 2011 when you just jump up one morning and declare a state of emergency. There were signs of an economic recovery in the early part of 2011, and they killed it off, called a state of emergency, killed off business activity, caused a tremendous slowdown in the economy, and then wanted to know by the end of 2011 why there is no economic growth. as though they couldn't see the logic. Right? Include even the oil rigs and so on. There were complaints about people not being able to work in the night shift and so on because of the state of emergency. So do not come here and act like if you just dropped from the sky. Also, I mean, they talked about there might be negative economic growth this year, and probably 15. But the negative economic growth started under you. Since January last year, the central bank, even though we have to question their figures, but that was under your watch. The recession was well underway. So don't try to make it seem as though since the PNM in power, all of a sudden there's a recession. I mean, that's being disingenuous, to put it nice. To put it nice. And the fact is you had $80 oil price, $90 and $100 at one point, and gas prices near $3, and some higher, as the minister said, in different Asian markets and South America and so on, and you still can generate any economic growth. In 5 years, what did you do? Okay. So the country has to understand what the PNM inherited and what it's dealing with. And I think people are much more aware of the situation. 2016 is not 1986. I think people are much more better informed. The labor movement is much more sophisticated and advanced, and they understand the economic problems the country is facing. Not the PNM, not the UNC, the country. Right? So they have an idea what it means. People have a better understanding. There's more cable, there's more social media, there's more, along with the internet access, and Mr. Vice President. So people are quite much more aware of the serious issues. So, they know not to take on the alarmist rhetoric that those on the other side are going to try to come and palm off on the population here today. Right. We know the average taxi driver, the person in the street, knows that oil and gas at the prices at which are prevailing now means that we are in a difficult, very difficult situation. And the picture I painted about the global economy and the potential crisis that lies ahead, back in 2010, 9 and 10, we were able to weather that financial crisis, as I said, because of the buffer, and we didn't have massive layoffs and big cuts in social programs, primarily because we had national savings to fall back on. In this case today, we have no such thing. Outside of the Heritage and Stabilization Fund, that's it. Right. So it means that we will have to borrow, as the minister pointed out, and any basic, sensible person understands that until we can get over.
Basic and sensible.
Yeah, well, I know that excludes certain people, but that's okay. But what we know is that the people understand the problem and they will not fly off the handle, so to speak. And they will understand that difficult measures, as the Honorable Prime Minister pointed out on Friday, will have to be taken in order for us to swallow our own bitter pill and not rely on external agents to come and tell us which pill to swallow.
That's right.
Because their pill will be a very bitter pill.
That's right.
Right? Ours, so far, is mildly or moderate. In fact, the Minister of Finance was rather measured in the measures that he choose to engage in to help stabilize the economy, because most of the social programs are still intact. What the minister didn't say was as important as what he said. And today he elaborated on it further when he said, well, we didn't touch GATE, we didn't touch CPEP and URP. What would you have done? I challenge, and just like him, many and any on the other side to say, what would you have done differently if you needed to cut 4 or 5 billion, let alone possibly up to 15 billion in revenue shortfall? What would be your approach? Right? So our social programs, the thing that really makes us different from a lot of the Caribbean economies and a lot of developing economies is our social programs, largely implemented by the PNM, and some of them expanded by the UNC, the same ones that they cursed when they were in opposition, like CPEP and URP and GATE and so on. They doubled and tripled them, and when they were in opposition, they ranted and raved about these things. So most of the social programs are intact, and the country can function relatively normally for some time to come. Of course, as many commentators have pointed out, if we don't get some relief, perhaps in the next year or so, things might change. But for now, we're holding it steady. And one of the disappointments, I'm sure, the UNC has is they thought that the minister would have cut even more and stifle the economy in the process. The fact that he didn't do it and took a very responsible approach leave them wondering what's up, because they thought they had wrecked the country enough to the point that the PNM would have to come in and cut everything and become unpopular instantly. That was their hope. That was the poison chalice they were depending on. Right? But that is not happening, to their dismay. So if we didn't do what was expected of them in terms of becoming unpopular, cutting all the programs right away, and that doesn't seem to carry any currency, that line of attack, what do? Well, they make it up. They just continue as though as if we cut everything and damaging the poor people and all this, explosive rhetoric. Let me just touch on a couple of other things, Honorable Vice President, before I close. I sat listening to the debate, the issues in the other place on Friday, and I find it quite strange that the UNC continues to raise questions over the foreign exchange situation, which is something I think, if they had any shame, they should be extremely ashamed of. I find it astounding that any UNC speaker, member, whatever, could raise issues about foreign exchange. When did the problem happen? You all don't know? When did this problem arise? And it, Mr. Vice President, is actually shocking and to hear them talk about, well, when are you going to do something about the foreign exchange crisis and so on. It started in 2014, a full year and a half of the UNC's reign. How come it didn't happen in the 21 years before? Yeah? 21 years before we had a stable foreign exchange situation. All of a sudden, big trouble. Yeah, where did that come from? It just happened out of the blue? Who was in charge? And the problems were so significant that, okay, yeah. So I'll just continue on this for a couple of minutes and then I'll wrap up, right? So now I've seen spokespeople disagreeing with the minister, talking about the exchange rate should go, leave it, let it float and go all up to 12 and God knows what number. And this is highly irresponsible. In times past, no serious economist, politician would want to speculate on the country's foreign exchange rate like that. It's just something you don't do. It's like, you know, it's like encouraging of speculation. Right? And some of the same people didn't say anything similar to that when oil prices were high and we were enjoying better times. So I find it quite strange that the minister took a very measured approach in terms of dealing with the foreign exchange crisis. And speaking of the currency band, in terms of which the rate might move, which should calm fears about further depreciation of the currency. But yet, you have people coming out, and which should be a good thing for all of us. Because I can assure you, unless you have narrow self-interest in that you are one of the people who took out a lot of US in the past 12 to 15 months, and you want to bring it back at 12 or 15 to 1, so you gain from that way. If you are not one of those people, you have nothing positive to gain from a dramatic depreciation of the currency. You have absolutely not. In fact, it would be terrible for 99% of the population. Right? And we know what it was like back in the 80s and with the devaluation and so on. Many of us are old enough to have lived through that.
Oh, yeah.
So I find it quite irresponsible and reckless for people to be advocating that kind of nonsense. Right? And many of our well-learned people, at least, you know. So we have to be careful in terms of the way going forward. The last thing I touch on is the tax on internet shopping. This is something that I had written about since 2001, to be, and I also published a second paper with my colleague from the university, Simon Fraser from management, on the consequences of online shopping back in 2006. Right? So this is something that we knew was going to happen with the advent of wider internet access and so on, and there are some issues, as the minister said, in terms of the application of the tax and the actual mechanics of how it will be assessed and how it will be collected. But the tax in itself is something that is probably overdue. As we know, online shopping is a tremendous source of leakage of foreign exchange, and also it encourages a certain amount of bypass of local producers and importers, of course. So therefore, and it is, after all, shopping. If you buy a shirt in Trinidad and you pay 15% VAT, and you buy a shirt in New York, you should pay 0. What is the logic? You know, what is the logic behind that? You know, so the idea of a tax on internet shopping is not something that people should be so alarmed about, right? Because, yes, and because because for the years past you got away with it and you didn't pay any taxes except you didn't pay any sales tax except the duties. Right, when you pay duties. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, it's just like a sales tax. And when the cars, when you pay sales tax, VAT, and duty, it's the same logic. Yeah. Okay. So, no, my time is up, by the way. So, with these few words, I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Senator Hadeed.
I speak on behalf of the people. Mr. Vice President, I'm pleased to join this debate where government is seeking to transfer $559,434,129 from the Ministry of Social Development and Family Services, Ministry of Education, Ministry of Health, Ministry of Housing and Urban Development, and Ministry of Sport and Youth Affairs to the Parliament, offices of the Prime Minister, Minister of the National Security, Minister of Labour and Social Enterprise Development, Ministry of Community Development, Culture and the Arts, and the Ministry of Planning and Development. I would like to deal today, Mr. Vice President, and my contribution would focus and deal with the misrepresentation of fact on a number of issues that has been made by the Minister of Finance over the last 6 months. The PNM government has elevated misrepresentation as a weapon of political strategy in an effort to mislead and misinform the people of this country on the current economic reality. When one cannot believe, imagine when one cannot believe what is being said and what is being told, Mr. Vice President, to the country, and twisting and turning information that misleads and misguides the direction that the country is supposed to be put into, to be explained properly what the problems are so we can face it. If we are being misled by the Minister of Finance and the government, how in the name could we believe that they can't put anything in place to straighten out the problems that the country faces today? Let me first deal with what was spoken here today by the Minister of Finance concerning the CLICO and MTHL shares. And he stated that as a result of mistakes that the People's Partnership made, we lost approximately $2 billion in revenues. He blamed the People's Partnership for that. Now, I am going to correct that piece of misinformation at this present time.
Yes. Well said.
He said, however, by September 2015, when we came in, all that had occurred in 2010 to 2015 period was as a result of an irresponsible breach of a shareholders' agreement, a contentious arbitration, and an order to the previous government to sell methanol shares at a price considered by many to be $2 billion below market, thus losing billions of dollars of assets value in the process. The facts are, the German shareholders of MHTL, whose interest in the billion-dollar company is held in a company called Consolidated Energy, alleged that the government transferred 6.54% of Methanol Holdings Trinidad Limited, held by CL, to CLICO on September 16, 2009.
Repeat that.
Alleged that the government transferred 6.54% of Methanol Holdings Trinidad Limited, held by CL Financial, to CLICO on September 16, 2009.
Who was in power at that time?
The PNM.
Exactly.
PNM was the government at the time. The transfer of these shares to CLICO gave the insurance company a 56.53% stake in the methanol company and a majority position in MHTL. KfW, the German financiers of MHTL and Consolidated Energy, comprising German companies Proman, Helm, and Ferrostahl, are claiming that the transfer of the shares from CL Financial to CLICO is in breach of the loan, security, and shareholders agreement by which MHTL was established and operated. That is the fact. Those are the facts. And one will go back to the Memorandum of Understanding of January 2009, when the government, the then government, transferred all of the assets of both CLICO, MHTL, and everybody into the government shareholding to hold, because they were going to bail, and this is a condition of bailing them out. So the problem started not during the course of the People's Partnership regime. It started under the PNM. And an article in The Guardian dated Saturday, May 7, 2011. I will continue, and I quote, "At the heart of the contention by the German shareholders of MHTL, whose interest in the billion-dollar company is held in a company called Consolidated Energy, is the allegation that the government transferred the 6.5% of Methanol Holdings Trinidad held by CL Finance to CLICO on September 16, 2009. The transfer of those shares gave CLICO, the insurance company, a 56.53% stake in the methanol company. The majority of the position in MHTL, KfW, the German financiers of MHTL, and Consolidated Energy, comprising German companies, Proman, Helm, etc. They claim that those shares transferred breached their agreements. And it was for this reason the start of the arbitration took place. So it had nothing to do with the People's Partnership.
You're misleading the country once again.
I now turn to the second issue of mass misrepresentation of fact made by the Minister of Finance. Mr. Vice President, I wish to refer to a statement as recorded in page 14 of the Hansard, in which the Minister of Finance stated, and I quote, "By way of example, just a few days before September 2015, the 2015 election, the former cabinet approved short-term loans 6 months facility of $1.6 billion to TNTech. This matured in February 2016. Can you imagine, and the antics he had going with it while he was saying it, can you imagine, Hans Flaring, while you have to send money for children, while you have to send money for the homes for the aged, Madam Speaker, while we are talking about this, which is what we are talking about today, can you imagine while you are grappling with this situation, being faced with the repayment to pay in full a $1.6 billion short-term loan with oil prices below $30, the government overdraft maxed the limit and the exchequer account overdrawn by $30 billion. This is what we face. This is what the Minister of Finance said, and I will show you and this country today. Misrepresentation once more. Mr. Vice President, the background to the loan was that TNTech owed TGU US $250 million for electricity supplied. TNTech was not in a position to settle the indebtedness. It was agreed that TNTech would borrow the money based on a government guarantee and pay off the outstanding indebtedness. In summary, the arranger of the loan was Republic Bank Limited. Republic Bank indicated that they could not raise the US loan in time required and asked whether they could advance the money in TT dollars and be given a period of time to raise the US loan. The government consented to this arrangement and gave Republic Bank Limited 6 months to raise the funds. Consequently, Trinidad and Tobago dollar loan was advanced by Republic Bank Limited for a period of 6 months, with the understanding that when the long-term US dollar loan was raised within the 6 months period, that would pay the proceeds off to TNTech. They would pay the proceeds over to TNTech, which would in turn sell the US to the central bank for TT dollars and use that to pay off the short-term TT debt loan. There was no additional risk being created for government, but this transaction, as long as the Minister of Finance proceeded with the arrangements that had been put in place, it is possible that the present government may not have followed through on the arrangements made the same way that it did not follow through on the cash flows due to the government from the TGU and the IPO. This is facts. If the money was not paid, if the debt was not paid, the government could not draw down on the monies that they are now drawing down on. And I remembered in the last Senate, I asked the minister, earlier this year I asked the minister about TGU. Who owned TGU? Because I said to him, I understood it was being sold to Ferrostal. And he said to me, the government do not own that asset. That's what he said here. How could a minister of government mislead and misrepresent fact?
Like that, Minister.
In that, I mean, it's impossible now to believe anything that comes out of the minister's mouth.
Yes.
How could you run a country, and how could a country take the word of a minister of finance who seems to be waffling with his contributions from day to day? Nothing that I can see or hear give me any inspiration whatever that he's going to tell the truth to this country. Another area of misrepresentation. I recall that on November 22nd, 2013, during the debate of the Excise Duty Compressed Natural Gas Order 2013, the Honorable Minister said, and I quote, "All this mad rush to CNG, the government needs to carefully examine what it is doing. Look at the amount of revenue that would be lost through import duty, motor vehicle tax, and other taxes on CNG vehicles. And see how long it would take for the fuel subsidy or with the reduction in the fuel subsidy to to compensate for that. But if you did a proper audit and try to understand why CNG has been a failure in Trinidad and Tobago, not just for the last 3 years, but for the last 20 years. Try and understand why, Mr. Vice President, and you do the kind of research that the car dealers have obviously done, you will understand that you're spinning top in mud. Not only has the Minister of Finance reduced taxes on CNG vehicles, he has also added hybrid and electric vehicles to the list. He has flip-flopped on his own words. Here you have, in one time in your life, you say X, and when you come in another time in your life, you choose to say Y. Words spoken in this parliament will come back to haunt any politician because they forget what they say, especially if they want to misrepresent the facts. I am not saying lie because I understand you can't say that in this parliament, but you're misrepresenting the facts. I would like to know if the Minister of Finance can share with us the audit that he claimed didn't make sense then. I know he will come here and wave a piece of blank paper like he always does. He said nothing, he said nothing, he said nothing, and he points, okay, Senator Dhanayshar, Mahabir, I have something noted for you. But he must answer questions. I will haunt him every day of his life whilst he is in the Senate to answer questions, and I will do it publicly. I will do it in here. I'll do it on the radio. I'll do it everywhere. He must answer questions. He cannot continue to misrepresent the truth. We must know the truth. And just for the records, I would like to point out why he can achieve this today and make the bold pronouncement that that's why he can do and bring CNG and vehicles to this extent. What was achieved under the for CNG under the People's Partnership government? One, the budget of 2010, we passed into law new incentives, such as the removal of motor vehicle tax and VAT on new CNG vehicles and on CNG kits. We gave tax credits for individuals who converted vehicles. We opened the first new CNG station in 20 years at Brentwood, Unipet, and Medford. We opened a new CNG station in the Eastern Main Road, this is the Peaks in Tagarigua. We built the Ramco Trinity Station, very soon to be outfitted for CNG. We built the new St. Christopher's on Ryson Road, very soon to be completed with CNG. Converted 10% of the PTSC fleet to CNG. New CNG buses will be operational this year. Built a CNG station inside City Gate to fuel the new CNG buses. NGC purchased 200 CNG vehicles. NGC built its own private CNG station. Petrotrain currently changing its fleet to CNG. Established in January 2014, the NGC CNG new company dedicated to implementing the CNG program. NGC CNG signed an MOU with the Maxi Drivers Association. NGC CNG signed an MOU with Unipet and the National Petroleum Marketing Company. NGC CNG and the Bureau of Standards have developed new CNG standards. The reason why the minister can't come and say this is what he's doing is simply because we've done the work for him. We have done the work for him.
Has been made.
I will continue.
No,
NEC has trained and is training CNG technicians. Awarded a conversion license to Massey Automotive Components Limited in Omira Road, Arima. Approved conversion license for Anson McCall and Dunmore. New gas station being built on the corner of Tampuna Road and Churchill Roosevelt High Road have CNG. The 10 sites recently mentioned in the newspaper were all planned and developed under the tenure of the People's Partnership via NGCNG. We are on this side very happy. We are very happy, Mr. Vice President, that the Honorable Minister has taken what we have done and have implemented it. The first of all that we have done, that's all he has done so far. I do hope he continues taking what we have done and complete it for the benefit of the citizens of Trinidad. Again, I want to point out what is fabrication and what is the truth. So my contribution, I said, Mr. Vice President, is solely to bring fact to the table and to dispense with fiction. Yes. Facts are not fiction. The Minister of Finance is on record as saying that the IMF, Standard & Poor's have all been critical of the economic management of the previous government. Comments that are totally untrue and misleading. This type of misleading information is part of what I call the PNM politics of destruction. They destroy everything that is good. They even at this time is destroying the country's reputation. The reputation of the country. Standard & Poor's never condemned the management of the People's Partnership government in its tenure in office. Let me spend some time, Mr. Vice President, to clear up some of the erroneous pronouncements made by the Minister of Finance. At their January 2015 visit to Trinidad, the IMF said the following: we support the government's prudent decision to prepare revised budget plans based on conservative price assumptions. There have also been further progress on financial reforms, while improvements in easing the cost of doing business have indeed been impressive. Procurement legislation has been passed and once implemented should help to improve expenditure, efficiency, and allay concerns regarding corruption. Since this government have come into office, Madam President, the procurement legislation is nowhere wrong. I am told that it is now going through another process of reformation, and God alone knows when this piece of legislation will see the light of day. Let me turn to Moody's Investors Services for a second, Madam President. On May the 4th, 2016, Moody's Investors Services placed Trinidad and Tobago Baa2 ratings on review. They said in part, Moody's would downgrade Trinidad and Tobago Baa2 rating if its rating review were to conclude that the government's plans are unlikely to be adequate to sustain Trinidad and Tobago economic or government balance sheet strength. I would like to suggest that should the country's Baa2 rating be downgraded, it would be because of the PNM's government failure to sustain the economic balance sheet strength that was left by the predecessor government in 2015. Another misrepresentation of fact, I would now like to turn to Standard & Poor's last December. Last December, this is what Standard & Poor's said in its statement. We are affirming our A, long-term foreign and local currency sovereign credit rating on Trinidad and Tobago. Standard & Poor's said we are revising the outlook of the long-term ratings to negative to reflect at least 1 in 3 chance that prolonged low energy prices would result in potentially low GDP growth prospects and a steadily rising debt burden, causing a downgrade in the next 2 years. Standard & Poor's said falling energy prices have also sharply reduced Trinidad and Tobago's typically large and current account surpluses. Typically large trade and current account surpluses. The Speaker, Senator Dr. Lester Henry, just intimated somewhere along in his contribution that the then government, did nothing. Falling energy prices, I like to repeat, by Standard & Poor's, falling energy prices have also sharply reduced the typically large trade and current account surpluses. Standard & Poor's continued, an increase in exploration activities in the oil and gas sector in recent years should sustain energy production over the coming decade, contributing to long-term economic growth. The former Minister of Petroleum, Mr. Kelvin Ramnarine, has to be commended for using his initiative in granting the oil companies concessions to continue and to start exploration and development in Trinidad and Tobago. I have said in this house on many occasions that it was not bad spending by the People's Partnership that caused the problems in Trinidad and Tobago. I have said it was because, Madam Speaker, from 2000 to 2010, drilling days and drilling activities came to almost nothing, none. If you do not replenish your dwindling reserves, you cannot expect to have oil and gas production to take care of the problems that we are facing today. There was no planning by the PNM governments between 2000 and 2010. They did not want to give up any tax revenues to the oil companies. We, as a responsible government, took the initiative through the Ministry of Energy and the Ministry of Finance to give the tax concessions. And that is why today, Honorable Senator Franklin, and you will agree with this, this is why today we have drilling activity in this country. No one could ever say that that is not so.
I will deal with that.
You could deal with what you want then.
11 more minutes, sir.
Standard & Poor's affirmed long-term foreign and local currency sovereign credit ratings, but revised the outlook based on what they forecast for the economy. The future of our economy has not deteriorated. because of the People's Partnership government. Should it deteriorate, it will be because of the PNM government's policies. Madam President, the Minister of Finance has not been telling the truth to the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago. The Minister of Finance did what he can do best: create chaos, panic, install fear, and create anxiety amongst the population. I call this destructive politics. Destructive politics. I deal now with the exchange rate. On Friday, Honorable Minister Imbert deceived the nation on the TT dollar exchange rate when he said, over the last 6 months, our exchange rate has moved 3.7% from $637 to $1 US to 661 TT dollars to $1 US. Minister of Finance Imbert further asserted in his best pretended honest Joe voice that appropriate measures will therefore be taken to ensure that our exchange rate does not move by more than a further 3.3% from today's rate. Madam President, compare Finance Minister Imbert's claim with the truth. The Unit Trust Corporation, which is wholly owned state financial organization, sells today a US dollar at 6.85, which means that the value of the TT dollar against the US dollar has eroded by 7.5%, double the figure that the Honorable Minister of Finance used to mislead the Parliament. I should say the other place. This means that the Finance Minister is talking tough and acting as if he understands where he is right now. His target for further erosion of the value of the TT dollar has already taken place. Further erosion will take place the way this minister is playing with the TT currency is like bleeding to death one drop at a time. If he intends to devalue the dollar, he needs to do so now and give the country confidence in the dollar. But the way he's playing with the dollar brings no confidence whatever. Today, people are selling the US dollar for $7.50. That's what the dollar is trading at today. We asked him a simple question. Does he? I think.
Are you aware of
I think.
the black market?
Yes, yes. Are you aware of the black market in the US currency? He stood up and said one word, no. He did the same thing today. No.
Arrogance.
The population going to tell him no one day. If he continues
Yes.
to
Insult.
insult the intelligence of this country, he will pay the ultimate price. During the People's Partnership government term of office, foreign exchange reserves expanded between 2010 and 2015 by as much as 22%, alongside a 59% expansion in the Heritage and Stabilization Fund to US $5.7 billion. I'm sorry, Dr. Henry isn't here to listen to this. Suppose he need to get something after what he said. Or go somewhere after what he said. On reflection, when looks at the mid-year review, the direct misrepresentation of foreign exchange can only conclude that if the PNM is basing measurements on distortions of fact, there's no way the country can realize realistic economic targets.
Senator Hadeed, your 5 minutes.
Thank you, ma'am. Another matter to be addressed is the distortion of the facts regarding the central bank overdraft. The Minister of Finance have made heavy weather over the central bank overdraft on the government's exchequer account, which Finance Minister Imbert going as far to refer it to as unprecedented recourse by the previous administration to the central bank overdraft. The first point is that the opposition had made clear on numerous occasions that the account was properly planned for, with 13 billion in revenue inflows expected over a 7-week period from 7th of September. After spending months dismissing the position of the opposition, and denying that any such inflows were planned, Minister Imbert on Friday tried to hurriedly skip past a very important statement he made in the media review, which is effectively an admission that the opposition position was correct. Despite denying collections on the existence of amounts owed by TGU, Finance Minister Imbert said, in addition, having already received US $300 million or 1.9 billion TT dollars from TGU, we expect to collect a further 255 million US dollars or 1.7 billion from TGU in the second half of the fiscal year. Madam President, this is the same gentleman that told me we didn't own this. How are we receiving money from something we don't own?
Yes.
If he can't even answer a question
Truthfully.
in this house truthfully, how are we going to believe anything that is said?
All right, I think at this stage, Senator Hadeed, I have to point out to you that you're saying you are imputing improper motives to the Minister of Finance by what you just said. Okay?
I withdraw. I will restate the statement. Despite denying collections and the existence of amounts owed by TGU, Minister Imbert said, in addition, having already received 300 million US from TGU, we expect to collect a further 255 million from TGU in the second half. I would like, at this stage, Madam President, to lay on the table that the Honorable Minister must, at all times, represent what's there and not what he wants to create to be there. So, it is my duty to advise the country to pay attention to what the opposition is saying and not to believe everything that comes from the government side. I thank you, Madam President.
Senator Mahabir.
Thank you very much, Madam President. At this time, Madam President, coming in number 2 on my bench, I feel there really is a lot that has been said. And I hope I should be forgiven a bit if I reflect on the economic history of Trinidad and Tobago. Madam President, in 1992, then Finance Minister Wendell Motley presented what I consider to be a watershed budget in Trinidad and Tobago. It was entitled From Stabilization to Growth. And that was a presentation that was made after 8 years of economic adjustment and stabilization, which spanned
three governments: the Chambers administration, the Robinson administration, and then the Manning administration. And in 1992, Finance Minister Wendell Motley could say that he is now presenting a budget that will move the country from a period of stabilization to a period where we can expect a growth momentum. And we experienced growth from 1993 well into a decade and a half later. When I reflect on this mid-year review, what I see is that the current finance minister is presenting a mid-year review after 8 years similarly of stabilization, which started in 2009, and it crossed similarly, Madam President, 3 administrations: the last Manning administration, the Kamla Persad administration, and now the Keith Rowley administration. So there are certain similarities between the 1992 presentation and the presentation today. But there is, Madam President, a salient difference. Whereas in 1992 we were speaking about the prospects for growth, in 2016, 8 years after our period of stabilization, second period has started, we are talking about a period of stabilization continuing. And the prospects for growth are nowhere on the horizon. And this, to emphasize Senator Dr. Henry's point, places us in a position of tremendous uncertainty. Because without growth, there shall be no revenue of two types. No increase in government's revenue, and no increase in foreign exchange revenue. The two types of revenue that we so critically need. And what we have been doing for the last 8 years is running deficit after deficit after deficit continuously, and the prospects for deficits over the next few years are also very much in order. So we would, in our economic history, be experiencing a period of more than 8 years where we have not been able to resume growth. And this is the makings of a situation where in Trinidad and Tobago we are now at a pivotal point that will require all of us in this chamber to craft solutions on how we are going to manage our way out of this persistent, protracted difficulty. I have not seen this before in our economy, and I have analyzed this economy since 1492, when 1498 rather, when in fact we had a European invasion. We did have an economy, Madam President, with the native people. And as much as I asked the anthropologists whether there was a currency then, they were not able to tell me. There was an economy. But whether there was a currency and terms of trade, I cannot say. But from 1498, I have a reasonable idea of how this economy has functioned. And we have not seen a situation like this prior. So we are in very interesting times. What have we been stabilizing? We have been stabilizing over the last 8 years a level of employment. If I sound professorial, Madam President, please forgive me. I like to understand and explain before I proffer a solution. And so we have been stabilizing employment. We have tried to maintain laudable objective, full employment over the last 8 years, spanning 3 administrations. But the cost of maintaining full employment has been at the expense of spending more than we have earned. And each year that we spent more than we earned, we built up a deficit, which was financed by borrowing. And we have borrowed continuously for the last 8 years. From whom? We have borrowed internationally. We have borrowed domestically, floating our bond issues. We have borrowed, as it came out recently, from the central bank via an overdraft that was larger than it should have been. So we have borrowed significantly. We have also sold some of our assets. But the borrowing is what concerns me, because we are going to be borrowing some more in the future. And the problem with borrowing is this, that there's a big difference between borrowing and grants. We need to repay. If we don't repay, we find that our credit worthiness is compromised and we face difficulties in raising financing as we did in 1992. We had difficulties in raising financing, but we also are going to require a larger and larger amount of our recurrent revenues to service our growing debt. It is in this context, I think, in this mid-year review, I would have liked for the Minister of Finance to let us know not only what the foreign reserve position of the government, of the central bank is, by extension the government. We know it is some 10 months of import cover, or 11 months, or about $10 billion. We know that, I'm coming to that, but we do not know the stock of debt in this country, the Petrotrin debt, the TNTech debt, the WASA debt, the central government debt, and the slew of debt which is rising, in addition to the CLICO debt. So I am hoping the minister will set to task his officers at the Ministry of Finance to let him know what the stock of indebtedness for which he is liable is at this time not difficult to determine at all, but it is information that we need if we are going to craft solutions out of the difficulties that we are currently facing. The reason, Madam President, is a simple one. Greece can initiate a huge amount of debt and get away because they are part of the EU. Puerto Rico has a huge debt problem, and it can escape, we're not so sure, but it can escape reasonably well because it can depend on financing arrangement from the United States. We are not so fortunate, and we have to be sure that we are not going to find ourselves in this situation. Reason, Madam President, is a simple one. If we cannot service our debt, we are going to jeopardize the long-term economic welfare of all of our people. So while we have short-term gain, we do not wish to have long-term pain. We want to ensure that over the medium term, over the next decade, for example, when hopefully all of us will be here, the quality of life of all can continue at least to be preserved at its current levels or to rise somewhat. The minister has, in addition to this, giving us the figure on the public debt situation, also give us some indication as to how he is going to finance the gap, the $15 billion gap that he has advised us. He has said that he is going to sell some assets, that they are assets for sale, the CLICO assets and so on that he will sell. Let's hope when there are these asset sales, Phoenix Park and some more FCB, that the IPOs then will be a little more transparent and a little less corrupt. So we do need to ensure that these situations we have learned from. Yes, we get the assurance that there is going to be a great deal of transparency. But in filling the gap, we know that he is looking at asset sales, sales of the country's property, sales of the country's assets. What does that do? What it does is that in the future, it undermines the country's ability to earn revenue from profits. The government can earn revenue from profits, as it has in the past, as well as tax revenue. And it is incumbent on the minister to ensure that when we sell assets, we are not compromising the ability of the future to raise revenue, especially in an environment where the growth prospects are rather dim for revenue enhancement. The minister has indicated that he intends to dip into the Heritage Fund. Well, I think the minister ought to know that that's a very sensitive issue. The heritage funds of Qatar and Kuwait and Norway and Saudi and those countries are in the hundreds of millions. I think the Qatari fund is something like $700 billion. And what happens there is that while they are dipping, it is going to be returned. It is going to be returned when you look at $700 billion owned by Qatar, by 5%, which is their targeted rate of return. They are estimated at some 35 billion per annum, and they can easily take 35 billion, and next year they know it will return in interest and principal. We are not so fortunate. We did not build up a fund to an extent where the returns on the fund, once it is withdrawn, will be returned in the next year, and therefore any withdrawal we take is really a withdrawal in principle. And that is something that we need carefully to watch. But the minister also has to indicate to us, while he said that he is going to cut his spending on the gas subsidy, Madam President, he has to indicate how he is going to share the burden across all sectors of the population. The petrol subsidy is one that all of us benefited from as a people, and once it is cut, all of us will experience a fall in our purchasing power, and we have to make the adjustments. Of course, more on that a little bit later. But I understand that there are companies in this country, large oil companies, that for this year, when the minister needs money the most, is not getting anything, because of the way the tax regime is so structured. And I think we need to be looking once again at how our tax structure on the business sector is created to indicate to the country that they too will be making an adjustment. That we are going to be looking at some loopholes. We are going to be looking at the corporate income tax. We are going to be looking at some of the petroleum taxes. We are going to be looking at some of these allowances which will allow oil companies not to pay taxes for a considerable period of time. We need drilling, but we also need revenue. And I think this is a time for us to renegotiate our pact with the private sector so that they too will share in the revenue that it will contribute to the revenue that the minister so badly needs at this time. And in that context, the government has created what I consider to be the most important institution of the last decade in this country. And that is, finally, we are serious about tripartism. We are speaking to labor, government, and business. And I commend the Honorable Minister of Labor, Senator Primus, for bringing the tripartite commission together so that we could begin to work, the tripartite council together, so that we could begin to work and begin to dialogue, and we can begin to craft the solutions that we need in order for us to move from where we are to a more acceptable position. But regardless of all of that, Madam President, regardless of all of that, it is always said that if the mountain will not come to Muhammad, then Mr. Muhammad will have to go to the mountain. What is the mountain? The mountain is that expenditure of the government of some now $59 billion. That is the mountain. And we cannot now say, the minister, when he addressed us in October, indicated that, well, he was not going to cut expenditure. I think that was just the politics there. The economic reality is that we need to be looking at whether the expenditure of $60 billion in the environment in which we are in which there is, Madam President, no light in the immediate or in the medium term with respect to raising the revenue, whether that is sustainable. And the answer is that if we are to protect the welfare, the public interest, we have to give serious consideration now, not only to enhancing the revenue flow, which we can do via increasing collections, asset sales. All these are temporary measures, because soon we will run out of assets to sell. Soon we will, Madam President, not be able to raise taxes more, because there's a time when you overtax a country and it leads to tax evasion. Soon the time will come when there will, the individual, the rational, self-interested individual, will find clever ways of not paying his share to the state. So we need to get optimum taxation. We agree with that. Optimum collections. But at the same time, we need, Madam President, to look at our expenditure, the expenditure in the state. The minister has started. He has started with that petroleum subsidy. He's cutting his expenditure there. He is going to have to continue. And he has to continue because this 15 billion he is speaking about that he has to finance must come from somewhere, and it is going to come from borrowing, which will lead to a further enhancement in the stock of debt. So again, I want to reiterate the point. We need our debt monitoring unit. I have said it before, but it is critical. We want to ensure that we do not reach a threshold where the amount he has to pay on debt servicing is almost equal to his public sector's wages bill. He has to watch that figure very carefully. It is like a medical doctor looking at a patient on the operating table and monitoring the blood pressure. He does not want the blood pressure to go to too much of an escalatingly high level. So he wants, the minister needs to control that level of stock of debt. The reason, Madam President, is this. When the revenue is flat and your debt is rising, then you have to pay a greater percentage of that 40 billion to service debt. A greater percentage of the 40 billion to service debt means less would be available for all the social services that all of us would want. The opposition, the independents, and the government, all the services we want the government to continue to supply. So let us look at the debt, let us look at our revenue collections, and let us look now at expenditure reduction. In expenditure reduction, we agree. We cannot continue with the level of subsidies that we have had in the past, because the economy has changed. Until we talk about restructuring the economy, which is going to take time. And just as an aside, Madam President, we have had 3 epochs of economic diversification. Senator Henry was right. The first in the 1960s, Aid to Pioneer Industries Act. The second was the Point Lisa's heavy industry. The third in Trinidad was LNG in the 2000s. We are looking for a fourth. And unless we find that fourth, here, the Minister of Industry and Commerce will be playing a critical role. Unless we have that fourth, so that we can participate more effectively in the global economy, we are going to find ourselves in a period of uncertainty. And while we are uncertain, we need to really reduce the expenses. And in this context, we know that the Minister of Finance, when he is allocating funds, has, Madam President, to send a directive to all his line ministers and to all the permanent secretaries on how they can reduce their level of spending. In fact, what I have seen here is that the minister has started. He has started with respect to the reductions in expenditures, which are amounts reduced: Ministry of Health, Ministry of Housing and Urban Development, Ministry of Sport and Youth Affairs. Well, I suspect he has eliminated some of the live sport from in there. Ministry of Social Development and Family Services. But what I have seen, Madam President, is that the minister has increased the Ministry of National Security by 40,000. And I asked myself, it was not an error, but I expected to see a reduction. You see, in this country, there is a view that the moment you mention the word national security, if there is a reduction in allocations there, it would appear as though the government is not interested in crime reduction. The reality is this: we have been allocating on an annual basis since 2000, every year an increase to national security, every year an increase over the previous year, and yet we are not seeing this reduction in crime. But just last week I heard the Honorable Attorney General, and information like this is very vital and critical, giving us a clue as to how you may reduce expenses there while not injuring the public interest. The Honorable Attorney General indicated in the public domain that in the prison system, there are a large number of persons who are in there not because they stole 20 billion like in the CLICO HCU thing and in the FCB IPO. They are there because perhaps they were smoking a joint of marijuana and they could not pay, or they failed to pay child support. They were low-risk prisoners. One suggestion: could we go through ministry by ministry like this? And just as the AG indicated that this is a feature in national security, could we not have, and this is where we need to be creative, all ministers need to be creative, every prisoner ranked low risk, medium risk, high risk. Low risk prisoners, well, let us just have them out of the prison system where they are costing us $25,000, so he says, per month. Bring them out, work with the community police to do community work, cleaning up the beaches, painting schools, doing repairs. It is going to benefit the community by getting work done. It is going to benefit the minister by saving money. And it is going to benefit the prisoner by getting him out of jail. I think these are things we need to be looking at ministry by ministry. And this is, I'd imagine, something that every minister will have to be charged with in the new environment. If I were the Minister of Finance, I will charge every minister in my cabinet. Find me ways in which we could discharge our functions without injuring the public interest and saving money. It's challenging, it will require creativity, but they are there. Live sports are there in every ministry, and the reason is, Madam President, we raise public spending from 13 billion to 52 billion in an 8-year period. Clearly, as we raise spending, there were many things in there that we could easily avoid. And we can afford it when we have money. We have no funds now, and it is called organizational slack. We need to cut that slack. Take the case of prison transport. We spend a large amount of money transporting prisoners. Every time I come to Parliament, I have to pull aside when the prison van is passing with an escort. That is costing money. It is somebody has a contract, I know somebody will suffer, but the minister can easily save some money. Could we not have the judicial arm of the state have locations close by the prisons so that you walk the prisoners over, less risk to the prisoners escaping and so on, and avoid the transport charge? We need not to spend our way out of the problem, Madam President. We need to think our way out of the problem. Think of it rationally. And again, in national security, we are allocating them 40,000 more ministers. I think we should cut some of them, and national security will not be compromised. National security in the past has required hardware, like a blimp, and armored personnel carriers. These things are expensive. Hundreds of millions, if not billions. I would recommend, in the interest of the public, that every such expenditure now be subject to a thorough cost-benefit analysis, so that we will know when we purchase an armored personnel carrier, a drone, an offshore petrol vessel, we will know in a reasonable way what we can expect to see with respect to crime reduction. If not, we simply cannot afford it. Cost-benefit analysis was passé when we were rolling in funds. Now it has to be reintroduced given the critical revenue shortage that we have. Madam President, the problem for us is that expenditure cutting is going to be difficult. But the reality for us is that it has to be done. And we need to educate the population. In fact, I think it is incumbent on all of us to educate the population that it does not matter who is in power. The environment does not respect the political party. The economic environment would have to be handled by the government and the opposition along the same lines. We have to adjust. I agree with Senator Henry. We must be in control of our adjustment, not an external agency. Let us adjust and cut in a manner that is convenient to us, and let us adjust in a manner that is convenient to us with respect to time. And while we are looking at each ministry, and so I expect the Honorable Minister to tell me about the public debt. I expect him to indicate that a directive has been given to all ministers. We are seeing as ministers report in the public domain. I can't know. I am not in there. We have little bits of information on what is happening in the ministries. When they appear before us in the joint selects, we see the amount of wastes which could be eliminated. But I think it should be for every minister a report to his cabinet colleagues on how much I have been able to save the government simply by reorganizing my ministry and finding a different way. And the minister will understand this. He has to ensure that they re-engineer their operations. We have to do that since we are in the environment of uncertainty. And as we re-engineer our ministries, as I think we can do health, Ministry of National Security, education, everything, there are some things I think the minister can do to bring some relief for the ordinary people. Let us allay the fears of the ordinary people. Let us tell them that although the revenue is just 40 billion, there are things which could be done and will be done that we could do now to improve the quality of their life. I raised this point, Madam President, on the last occasion. I saw no traction on it. But take the case of one of our most vulnerable groups in society, our old age pensioners. Many of the old age pensioners are immobile. But old age pensioners must report to the old age pension office once a year still to ensure, to let the officers know that they're alive. You know, NIB, we were able to get NIB to get rid of this. The private sector is following. I think we could simply look after our senior citizens by telling our Minister of National of Social Services, look, just follow the NIB model. Just let the old age pension office look at the amount, the death certificates on a monthly basis, simply strike off from their list of recipients all the death certificates, and those who are not on a death certificate are alive, and don't subject the people to this kind of harassment. Many of them are elderly. As now chairman of Social Services Committee, we will be looking at some of these things because it is going to cost the senior citizen taxi money now to go down to the office simply to show he's alive, money, $200, $300 that he can keep for himself. Will not cost the Minister of Finance anything, will save the old age pensioner $300 or $400 a year. Let us now look, Madam President, at a suggestion raised by Senator Small. He has raised this in the past. Let us see how it is going to play on this occasion. And this is in the old days of the 1980s, when the government needed to borrow. It had a program known as the 5% tax-free savings bonds. And once someone purchased the bonds, up to a certain limit, they got 5% on the bonds, and they got a tax credit from the minister simply because they saved with him as opposed to saving with the commercial bank. I think given the huge borrowing requirement of the honorable minister, and the minister is persuadable. I see the minister, although he may put on a kind of a stance, he is persuadable. And I would try to persuade the minister to give some consideration to the reintroduction of this particular program, so that the savers out there who are getting nothing for their money can lend to the minister, and not only the financial institutions will benefit. And honorable, through you, Madam President, the honorable minister can work through the unit trust. Let the unit trust open a bond fund. They have a money market fund and an equity fund, a bond fund. And so if I want to purchase the minister's bonds at 5% or 6%, I simply buy units in the Unit Trust Corporation, and I am able to get that high rate of interest. At the same time, if he wishes to give a tax credit, he can do that. But the 5% tax-free savings bonds idea, with a tax concession, I think can really benefit the retirees, the public servants with gratuities, I'm coming to that, and people with some money who get nothing from the commercial banks. And people who get nothing from the commercial banks, Madam President, is everybody. I have here a bank statement, and again, a suggestion to the Minister of Finance. I won't mention the bank, except that's a very regal bank. And the balance, the opening balance on this fund is $21,162.70. Joint account between two Mahabirs, my daughter and myself. This is my daughter's money. And I taught the child to save money. She saved up $21,162. At the end of the month, the amount here is $21,142. She didn't withdraw anything because she's abroad. $25 came out as a service charge from this account. Basically, you started with $21,162, you ended up with $21,142. What we are in here is negative interest rates. The bank is charging $25. No interest, you know. Senator Small, check that out. No interest payments. And so, I would like to recommend to the Honorable Minister of Finance that, Madam President, that he would review the Central Bank Act, and upon review, allow the central bank the power to regulate bank fees, because the amount raised in fees are in the hundreds of millions of dollars. And at a time of economic decline, when banks can't make money one way, they will tax the customers in another way. So we need to review that Central Bank Act for that purpose. Central Bank Act. Bank charges, regulate them. Let the central bank regulate. This is what...
Right, it had to be reduced.
Reduce them. All right. Let me recommend again with respect to pensions. It is now 10 months that the government of Trinidad and Tobago owes me a pension for serving in the last parliament. When I try to explain to people, Madam President, who are waiting for their pensions 2 years and 3 years and so on, I say, but I am supposed to be a big man in this country. And 10 months later, I can't get the pension. And it cannot be that they are finding it difficult to calculate my pension, because, Madam President, I can calculate it in 2.5 minutes flat. Given the small amount and given the simple formula, they owe me something like 60,000. They owe Senator Small and Senator Roach the same amount. And senators on the front bench too, Senator Hadeed probably is entitled to some pension too. What I would recommend, thank you. What I would recommend, Madam President, is that we set a cap. The Honorable Minister of Finance should let his department know that they should finalize someone's payments within a 12-month period. That seems reasonable. And if 12 months were to elapse, then we should get an interest payment. I would say, since we have to pay the BIR when we owe money, when the government owes us money after a year, I think it's only fair. They pay me 10% per year, per annum, or any part thereof, for holding back my money for no just cause. There is no reasonable cause. And so, especially when they don't need any more information, they don't need any more data. So that's something for him to consider. Foreign exchange allocation. Well, the Minister of Finance gave the assurance that he was going to look at forex allocations to people for health and education. I speak not for myself only, but, Madam President, for people across the country, foreign education. I tried to obtain 5,000 Canadian to pay fees. Last week, Wednesday, I got 1,500. Thursday, I got nothing. Friday, I got nothing. Monday, I got nothing. Today, I was told I could get another 1,500. Clearly, in the bad old days, when you needed forex for a foreign education, you simply presented your school letter to, Madam President, the central bank, and they stamped it, and the bank, the commercial bank, was bound to give it to you. Now, with the bank under control, taking out $25 for which they have done nothing, and every time they sell me 1,500, I have to pay a wire fee to them and a wire fee to somebody else, and so they are hitting me senseless. I would like the minister who has given us the insurance to simply now have the directive sent out, cast in stone. And the directive is simply this: health and education, please don't fuss. That's critical for the country's welfare. So, Minister, I look forward to when the commercial banks will begin to really comply with the directives that you will give them. Madam President, just 2 more points before I close. We have heard talk about property tax. That is, like the Heritage Fund, it's going to be a contentious issue. But let the minister give consideration to the fact that the country has recognized that we do need to pay a tax on property. But across all locales, property taxes are not meant to go into general revenue, they go into local government. Once you marry property taxes with the local services we receive, it is going to be equitable and fair. There are people out there who built houses for $40,000, 1973. Houses are now valued at $4 million. Their salaries did not rise in tandem, and they are panicking simply because of what the minister says. He can allay some fears. And finally, Madam President, let me see how we could bring some relief to the commuting public. Whenever we talk about raising the prices of gasoline and the fact that someone has a car, we know in the North Atlantic there is an option. The option is mass transit. In Trinidad, when we abandoned the train in 1966, we never really had a good mass transit system. There is an option. The option is what the government itself implemented a couple months ago, a short while ago. The government invited me to the inauguration of the Council on Tripartism. I was asked to park at Queen's Hall, and I took the shuttle to the diplomatic center. It was park and ride, and the reason was it was going to be difficult to accommodate everybody in the diplomatic center. Could we not extend park and ride so that down by Nagar, Nagar out there we have a parking, out opposite Trinity Mall we have parking, so Senator Small and colleagues from that area can simply park there, ride to Port of Spain on a shuttle. There's a benefit. When you ride with a lot of people, I met a lot of trade unionists, and I met a lot of industrialists at the same time on the bus. There are benefits. So let us look at park and ride. And also, Madam President, decentralizing. When the Minister of Planning could be asked to decentralize, continue that. It will give the motoring public, Madam President, an opportunity. Park and ride so that they don't have to use their car and consume so much petrol. Decentralize, work closer to home. Madam President, I must conclude, but there are many things we can do. We need to think our way. The solutions are not hard. Once we do that, this crisis, this difficulty shall pass. Madam President, I thank you.
Madam President, I rise to join this debate on the finance variation of appropriation financial year 2016 bill 2016. This bill simply seeks to move around allocations on heads, and that was fairly well articulated by the Minister of Finance during his presentation. It only calls for $16 million in additional revenue, in additional expenditure for the Parliament, and all other allocations are internal adjustments, largely based on the realignment of the ministry portfolio and the orders as to what functions fall with each ministry, and it is listed here in the documents. So I wouldn't repeat it because it was said by a lot of the speakers before me. Madam President, before I begin, I want to formally congratulate the Minister of Finance again for a well-presented document, especially in the lower house, where he had 90 minutes, 88 minutes he took, and I think he did an excellent job. Here you got an abridged version, but just as lucid. And I want to bring the attention to this house that, if I should say so myself, he just keeps getting better and better. And in my view, and this is an honest view, I'm not pampering to him at all, he has brought an analytical and organized mind of an engineer to the very chaotic financial situation and economic environment he finds himself in. He has brought order and clarity, most important, to the CLICO situation, and I will spend a couple minutes on that. He has brought order and clarity to the cash flow situation, the overdrawn exchequer account, the central bank overdraft limit. We are now starting to see a semblance of order in all this chaos in the financial situation that we met. He has brought order and clarity in defining the deficit. So after his presentation in the House last week Friday and today, we are now seeing what the deficit will really look like and how we plan to narrow the deficit by cutting expenditure, trying to increase revenue, but more importantly, this year in particular, by the sale of specific assets. And speaking of that, before I delve into my core presentation, let me just rebut or make some comments on statements that were made. Senator Mahabir spoke about we should not sell the CLICO assets. Well, we should consider looking at the revenue or profits from these assets and not trying to sell it. Yeah. I just want to draw to the attention of the House that the CLICO assets were not bought as an investment. They were part of a bailout situation. So when the federal government of America bailed out Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, they didn't keep their investment in these institutions and say, I will get profits from them when they become profitable. They wanted back their money. So we cannot keep the CLICO assets and now make them state enterprises. We won back the cash we had put out during the bailout, and that is the basis of the sale. It has nothing to do with investments.
Would the minister give way?
Yeah, I will give way.
Yeah, Minister, I was probably referring to that. What I'm referring to are the sales of, say, the FCB IPO, where we are selling out state assets to fill our gap, and second, the Phoenix Park. Those are the assets that you own, and those are the assets that will generate profits for you, which will not be available to you if, in fact, they go to
But for the records, we did not do that. And you did, in fact, talk about the CLICO assets. So I stand corrected. With regards re-engineering of the ministries, I will deal with that later in my presentation. The Ministry of Local Government is being re-engineered for in local government reform context. The reduction of expenditure, and I want to spend a minute on that, because we have grown accustomed in this country to massive expenditure. I just want to draw the attention of the Senate that in Mr. Manning's last budget, the 2009-2010 budget, the expenditure was $45 billion. And this skyrocketed expenditure started under the UNC in 2010-2011, and they reached $63 billion in 2015.
What did he inherit?
Awful. Oh.
So, lady, and they had that level of expenditure when oil prices for 3/4 of their time was in excess of $100 per barrel. They ramped up the borrowings. So your debt to GDP ratio ramped up. Your income stream from oil and gas ramped up. And yet you have nothing to show for it, except a limping highway going down to Point Fortin. And all you have in Trinidad and Tobago to show is box drains. Box drains. And let me just retract here. This country experienced 3 energy booms. The first was under Dr. Williams. 1973, OPEC oil price skyrocketed. We got into the East Coast discoveries, and we introduced something called the Supplemental Petroleum Tax, which was a windfall profit tax. It brought in massive revenues into the country. The analysts say it wasn't well handled. They have all type of analysis. But at the end of the day, agriculture was subsidized, fuels were subsidized, transportation was subsidized. But look at Port of Spain. You have the Twin Towers to show. You have the Haley Crawford Stadium to show. You have Mount Hope Medical Hospital to show. You have the Solomon Hochoy Highway to show. You have the dueling of the Churchill Roosevelt Highway to show. You have the Hall of Justice to show. The Mokorapo foreshore. All these were infrastructural building in the country. The second energy boom came under Mr. Manning. And Point Lisa as well, that was diversification. But the second energy boom came under Mr. Manning's regime, when the gas price in particular, Minister Imbert and Senator Small mentioned the high gas prices that we experienced in 2005 going on to 2008, when you had $15 billion surplus, $12 billion surplus. What did the Manning administration do? You have the waterfront and the Hyatt to show.
That's right.
Good. You had the Grand Bazaar interchange that was built by the Honorable Minister of Works at the time. Good. You had the third carriageway of the Churchill Roosevelt Highway. You had Napa and Sapa. Okay. And more importantly, and Mr. Manning's legacy will be recorded in that regard, he invested for the first time heavily in human capital. And the tertiary education moved from 15%. CDAP, UTT, tertiary education moved from 15% to well over 50%. We have invested in human capital. And ladies and gentlemen, members of the Senate, members of the public, the third energy boom came under the last UNC administration. $100 oil price from 2012 to 2014.
Streams.
And what you have to show for it? A limping highway to Point Fortin, which I will deal with later. You ramped up the borrowings. And all you have to show is overpriced projects and tremendous box drains throughout Trinidad and Tobago. I stand here to say today again, as we said it all on the platform, the UNC government was a box drain government. All they have given this country was box drain.
Prices equal to box streams.
Just rebut Senator Hadeed on one point he made when he said Minister Imbert spoke about the failure of CNG over the last 20 years. He said that in a context.
I say that?
No, not in this thing, in a previous answer he read. But the point he was making at the time, that CNG cannot work with the current price of diesel. So if you had no intention of removing the subsidy on diesel, it made no sense investing in CNG because the incentive would not have been there. Today, we have taken a decision as a government that we will be weaning the population away from the diesel subsidy. So now that puts the context in which we can proceed with an expansion of the CNG market. Okay, so that is the context in which he made this thing. And finally, Senator Hadeed, he spoke about Moody's and Poor's and IMF and things. But just for the records, let me see. The IMF report, Article 4, Mission to Trinidad, states clearly that despite the great challenges posted by the need to adjust to energy prices, Trinidad and Tobago still has enormous strengths, including a well-educated workforce and a stable political system, with substantial financial buffers and low, albeit rising, public debt. Trinidad and Tobago is not in a crisis. Nonetheless, in recent years, and this is the point, in recent years, that's the last 5 years, and 1 year already even invite them. In recent years, taking into account the size of the energy windfall, this country has undersaved and underinvested. Undersaved. Where is the saving? Budget deficit after budget deficit. And underinvested.
Okay, what's the standing order?
So, Madam President, let me proceed with the core of my presentation. And I just want to go back to the presentation that the Finance Minister made in the other place. And a lot has been said about what he said about gas and oil and removal of VAT and whatever, and on specific terms. But he made certain fundamental points that I think evaded the attention of most of the speakers. And I want to quote from his presentation in the lower house. Because, Madam President, Trinidad has changed fundamentally. And I quote from the Honorable Minister of Finance. Madam Speaker, if anyone in Trinidad and Tobago doubted that we are in a new paradigm in terms of national income and expenditure, those doubts should have been erased by now. Indeed, the change in the global economic environment, particularly for oil-based economies, has caused what is referred to in the literature as a sea change. Point number one, Senator Mahabir, a sea change. Senator Small, a sea change. And he went on at the end of his presentation to make the same point. And I really want to make it again here today. It involves spreading the burden of adjustment across the society and getting used to the fact that, as the economists would like to say, that we are now in an era of a new normal. A sea change, a new normal. And then he used the colloquialism to end off by saying, we must now cut our cloth to suit our measure, and you cannot have champagne peace with Moby pocket. The colloquial to the sublime. The literature, the economists, the professionals, all well captured in this document. And Madam Speaker, I just want to let this nation know, as Dr. Oli liked to say, the circumstances in Trinidad and Tobago has changed fundamentally. Fundamentally. And let me call on Senator Choate. You're watching, but in law, there's sometimes in contract law, there's something called change circumstance. And change circumstance is sometimes a clause that is included in contracts. That when circumstances change at such a fundamental level, that opens up back the contract for renegotiation. Okay, and that is the position we find ourselves in today. Because, Madam President, through you, prosperity in this country could no longer be based on the bounty of God. Prosperity in this country now has to be defined by our creativity, by our resilience, and by the productivity of the people of Trinidad and Tobago. We cannot no longer depend on the bounty of God as it is reflected in oil and gas revenue. I just want to put a little historical context into this now. There's a misnomer in this country that Trinidad is an oil-rich country. That is furthest from the truth. That was long ago. In 1977, crude oil production peaked in this country at 276,000 barrels per day. I was working at Moko at the time. I just left high school in Point Galliota because I'm from Mayaro. And the oil fields of Pui, Teak, and Saman, which was the three Amoco oil fields at the time, was producing at 150,000 barrels per day. We used to be selling out an oil tanker every 3 days out of Galliota. Now it takes 3 months to fill a tanker. 150,000 barrels a day. And then the trust in exploration at that point in time was to find more Pui, Teak, and Salmon. As a matter of the American Association of Petroleum Geologists, the AAPG, published a special bulletin on Teak Field and called it the giant oil field of the decade, 1970 to 1980. As we speak, that Teak oil field in Galliota has produced over 1 billion barrels of oil. Check that in today's terms. It is the only oil field in Trinidad that has crossed the billion barrel mark. Today, Puitik and salmon has been leased out to Repsol, and they produce a mere 15,000 barrels a day as we speak. That is the life, 15 to 20,000 at most. That is the life cycle of an oil field. Senator Mahabir is right, you have to continue the exploration process. But I'll give you some petroleum history. Amoco continued to explore for oil, hoping to find more puitiks and salmon. And all they found was gas. In those days, when an exploration well was logged by Schlumberger, and the logs came to shore, in those days they didn't have digital technology wiring it to Houston. You had to physically wait for the log. And you see gas, you stoops. Gas again, and the gas inventory was piling up and piling up and piling up. As a matter of fact, in the exploration history of the East Coast, the first actual gas prospect was drilled quite in 1989, because every discovery of gas that was made prior to 1989 was found in the search for oil. And then, what did we do? The PNM administration developed a gas monetization policy under Patrick Manning. And the gas monetization policy is what brought all the revenue to Trinidad over that period. Today, we are in a downturn. We have to boost exploration. BHP is in the process of doing a deep water well. Senator Small spoke of it. The Minister of Finance spoke of it. Keep our fingers crossed. The technology is there today to image the subsurface. And we are banking a lot on this as a country. And everybody in Trinidad and Tobago should go down in the knees tonight and pray for a discovery to be made there. I just want to say something now on the refining sector. Because there are structural weaknesses in the local petroleum sector. In the 1970s, the Point-A-Pierre refinery was a big Texaco fuel oil refinery. A capacity of 350,000 barrels per day throughput. At that point in time, all the majors had fuel oil refineries in the Caribbean to service the fuel oil market in the eastern seaboard of the United States. They had massive refineries in Aruba, in Curacao, in St. Croix, and then Point-A-Pierre. There are no longer any refinery in Aruba, you know. There are no longer any refinery in Curacao, you know. There are no longer any refinery in St. Croix, you know. They were all shut down in the early 80s. As a government, we tried to protect what should have been a dying refinery. The same thing we did for Caroni 1975 Limited. You cannot protect something that is dying forever. The approach we took, we should do a refinery upgrade. So, we spent billions of dollars on what you call the gasoline optimization project, on the ultra-low sulfur diesel project. And while this has brought some greater level of efficiency to the refining business, and right now Petrotrin boasts that they're making a $10 margin on the barrel because of the low oil prices, in hindsight, it would have been better to shut down the refinery and build a brand new 100,000 barrel a day modern refinery to refine local crude only.
Correct. It will cost less.
It will cost less, and today we'd have been laughing because the foreign exchange that is pumped to import 100,000 barrels of crude per day to run in a still largely not as efficient refinery as you want it to be. It is draining the foreign exchange of the country. It is hampering the cash flow of Petrotrin. And worst of all, the subsidy is now become unbearable to the government of Trinidad and Tobago. So that is the situation we find ourselves in. Especially at Petrotrin. Petrotrin is in some serious trouble, and the country should know that. They will appear before I think they have appeared before the Joint Select Committee on State Enterprises. And you have asked for more information on certain projects. Let the chips fall where they may. And let me just deal very shortly before I move into another point on petroleum taxation. Because there are people in this country who feel that if you're producing 100,000 barrels of oil per day, and oil selling at $50 a barrel, the government getting $5 million every day. It is not so. The government only gets revenue from the energy sector through petroleum taxation. And that is something that the country needs to understand. And petroleum taxation is a unique form of taxation because it is taxing the extractive industry, the non-renewable resources of a state. And the principle of energy taxation and non-renewable taxation, the taxation of wasting assets, is that the state, on principle, because the resources belong to the state, must extract maximum economic rent from that asset, because it is not renewable. If you have a copper mine in Zambia, and you mine out the copper and Zambia doesn't get any money for the copper, doesn't replenish itself. By the same token, the oil reserves and the gas reserves doesn't replenish itself. So the nature of your taxation has to reflect the fact that you are taxing a wasting asset. And Trinidad's current tax scenario is not bad, you know. It is a balance between encouraging investment from the energy sector and getting maximum economic rent for what the state owns. And I'll just go through the scheme for you. The energy companies get revenue from the sale of gas and the sale of oil. That is gross revenue. From your gross revenue, the first thing that is deducted from the top is royalties. Royalties range from 10 to 12.5%, depends on what blocks are there. So the state gets, at a minimum, 12.5% of the gross revenue of every single barrel or MMCF of gas that is sold in Trinidad and Tobago. After that, you can deduct operating expense, capital allowances. Then you now become subject to supplemental petroleum tax, which is a windfall tax, which is not applicable as we speak, because supplemental petroleum tax only kicks in above $50 per barrel. And then, on your taxable profit, the petroleum's profit tax is 50%. And the unemployment levy is 5%. So it's really 55% effective petroleum's profit tax. Corporation tax for the industry is 30%. And you're paying 55% after you've already paid royalties and after you've already paid supplemental petroleum taxes based on where the oil prices is. So, in essence, this is not a bad taxation regime for the state. But what has become contentious, and the Minister of Finance has said it and was alluded to by Senator Mahabir, is the situation we find ourselves in this year and possibly next year is the write-off of your exploration expenditure in 1 year. 100% capital write-off. And with low oil prices, where your revenue stream has dwindled, where your gross revenue has dwindled, where exploration cost is significantly high and it goes into billions of TT dollars.
8 billion US.
US. So that is almost 10 billion TT dollars.
More than 10.
About 10 years, 8 years, 6 and about 12 billion TT dollars. If you are allowed to write off that in 1 year, you obviously wouldn't be subject to tax.
Negative cash flow.
Negative. And then you could carry over the write-offs, you know. Not to say that you have it in this year, then you use up all and the rest is abandoned, you know. You could roll over what you're not using to the following year. So you may not have a tax liability for 5 years.
Carry forward, yes.
So when Senator Mahabir, Senator Hadeed in particular spoke boastfully about Senator Ramnarayan's tenure.
He knows nothing.
You spoke in glowing terms of Senator Ramnarayan's tenure as minister, and as Dr. Rowley said, he was already sewing a suit to get an award to be the best energy minister in the world. Somebody they paid for that award to give it to him. Good? It makes no sense. Yeah.
Madam President, Standing Order 51-1F with reference to Senator Hadeed.
Senator Hadeed. Just let us hear the minister's contribution, please.
So Senator Mahabir is right. While the basic framework of the taxation legislation is robust, that concession made by the UNC administration to allow 100% write-off in the year that it was expended and to carry over the surpluses on the expenditure is not acting to the benefit of Trinidad and Tobago as we speak. One thing about us, PNM administration and Trinidad in general, we honor the sanctity of the contract. We honor our legislation. We'll have to meet the companies and try to negotiate ourselves out of this dilemma, understanding both parties, and hope that we come to an amicable compromise. Again, just for the records, I'm just trying to put the energy sector into context, and to show you all that is a new normal in truth. And then Senator Gopi Spoon will speak about diversification. She will speak about other aspects of the economy. Senator Clarence Rambarat and possibly Avinash Singh will speak about agricultural, boosting agricultural production, dropping the food import bill, making agriculture move from 0.5% of GDP to something like 1.5% within a reasonable period of time. In 2012, oil revenue as a percentage of total revenue was 37.06%. In 2013, it's 32.49%. 2014, 33.17%. 2015, 21.31%. And forecast for 2016 is a mere 7%. Imagine Trinidad and Tobago. We used to boast in 2006, 2007, 50% of national revenue came from the oil sector. We're down to 7% members of the Senate, through you, Madam Speaker. Madam President, sorry. It is really a new normal. It is a sea change. Understand that. Put it in your pipe and smoke it. This is nothing to smile about. It's nothing to cry about also. But we now have to start the process to be a resilient people. As I said in my opening remarks, we can no longer depend on the bounty of God. We have to depend on our own resilience, our own creativity, on our own productivity. Trinidadians have to stand and wake up. Remember when George Jebba said, the Fed done? The Fed done again. The laziness has to stop. The unproductivity has to stop. People now have to go out and give us a fair day's work for a fair day's pay. In all sectors, the public sector, the private sector, the service sector, the manufacturing sector, everybody has to do it. So, I have given a sort of historical synopsis of the energy sector, both upstream and downstream. I have shown you where the taxation laws are fairly good in principle and in theory, but where the major issues lie as we speak. And finally, Madam President, let me just speak about all those who say they want to support touching the Heritage and Stabilization Fund and what have you. We know it will be touched as a last resort. But as Minister Imbud said in the other house, it is not a trophy on a wall to just stay and look at it. It is designed to stabilize when your revenue stream has dwindled because of commodity prices. Because in this single economy, the single product economy, you suffer from what you call price shocks. And these funds were created to hedge your risk against price shocks. And we are experiencing a significant price shock. I'm reading from an internet article here from Bloomberg's Business. Norway to start withdrawals from oil fund to plug deficit.
Saudi Arabia did it?
Yes, I'll have one on Saudi Arabia too, so I'll go through it very quickly. Saudi to start withdrawal from oil fund to plug deficit. Not Saudi, Norway. Norway predicts it will for the first time.
How much? That was before? They have 600 now.
Norway predicts that it will for the first time need to withdraw cash. But Norway is big to 820 billion sovereign wealth fund, the largest in Western Europe, to record chunks of its petroleum revenue to cover budget holes and stimulate the economy. Norway is doing it. Good? Saudi Arabia, Senator Small mentioned it, planned to privatize some aspects of Aramco's assets. Okay? And here how it goes. If the float goes ahead, it will be the world's most valuable quoted company, dwarfing Apple, Exxon, and Google. Saudi Aramco is worth 10 times Google here. And lastly, Madam President, Saudi plans spending cut, reforms to shrink budget deficit. Here what Saudi is going to do for the first time in its history, Madam President. They are going to adjust the subsidies on water, electricity, and petroleum products.
Imagine that.
The great Saudi Arabia is not going to increase the price of gas.
Imagine that. And electricity and water.
Electricity is going up in Saudi. Water is going up in Saudi.
Standing order 51 1F. Senator Hadeed cannot keep quiet. I ask you to assist, Madam President. I want to hear the member.
Honorable Minister, please continue, but could I just say, not just Senator Hadeed, but could all members listen to the Honorable Minister in silence?
Thank you, Madam President, for that protection. But what we are saying, Saudi is going to divest certain aspects of Aramco's operation. They're going to drop the fuel subsidy and going to increase the price of gasoline. They're going to cut out some of the subsidies on electricity and water, because water is a big commodity in Saudi, it's a big desert. So they are on the same track that we are following, or we are following on the same track that they have followed. I don't know which came first, the chicken or the egg, but I'm just drawing this reference to countries like Norway, Saudi, Kuwait, Bahrain. They are all moving along the same line as this PNM administration. Madam President, I just want to spend the next 3 or 4 minutes on a thing that I feel the country should know a little further on. Just is the Point 14 highway. I guess not finding one. Okay, went on the Point 14 highway. Yeah, I will Stuart Young delivery. Madam President, a contract was awarded to OS for 5.3 billion TT dollars. I've made this statement in this house already, but I'll say it again today. I will say it again. It is the largest single infrastructural project ever undertaken by the government of Trinidad and Tobago. And in good UNC style, they funded it from the current account. It is unheard of in any part of the world. If Saudi Arabia have to build a highway, they still wouldn't fund it from the current account. They might still go for a loan. How they did that, how did they come up with that idea, God alone knows. But having said that, the highway continued. They turned the sod. They didn't have the site ready for the contractor. Jacona threatened Mr. Dukaran for $1.5 billion. You remember in 2011, 2012, they walked with a big check, so $1.5 billion. Mrs. Kamala Prasad, the predecessor, went on the excavator and pulled something, bigger bucket, and the press had 3 headlines that day. Nothing happened for 1 year after that, because the site was not ready. They had to pay compensation to the contractor. But having said that, the Point 14 highway will go down as the most mismanaged project in the history of Trinidad and Tobago.
5 more minutes.
Yeah. And I just want the country to know, you see the creek, where they bank up all that material on the left side of the creek, all that have to dig back up and be relayed.
Bad work.
Because of bad work. Senator Shriki Suni is be down south, Senator Ram Kisuni down. That whole style, I think, because the compaction was bad. All had to be excavated, redone, and compacted in layers. Poor supervision. Poor supervision by the engineer and the client, NIDCO, AECOM, OS. Okay? That is what has to happen. Okay? But having said that, when you looked at the Point Fortin Highway alone, when you look at the type of equipment that was being used, you know something was wrong with that contractor from day one. They never had the semblance. The signage was bad. They didn't have the ambience and the verve of a big contractor handling a $5.3 billion project. As we speak, nothing is happening there. But I just want to spend the last 3 minutes that I have on something called Addendum 2. When the contract couldn't be completed, on September 4th, 2015, the last working day before the general election, September 4th was the Friday, September 6th was the Saturday, September 5th was the Saturday, September 6th was the Sunday, and September 7th was the election. On Friday, September 4th, 2015, the former government entered into a written agreement with the OAS called Contract Addendum 2, whereby they explicitly recognized that OAS was bankrupt and stated that they could invoke Clause 15.2e of FIDIC contract, immediately terminating the contract, which is what they're supposed to have done. However, despite this, they proceeded secretly to give up this right of termination and waive all claims against OS, thus releasing and discharging OS from any liability to Trinidad and Tobago. Imagine that. This is the contract itself, and here what it says, claims. Here what it says, claims, You know this contract limping along, bad work all over, okay? They're not meeting any deadline. And here what the section of claims on this contract states. Based on this Addendum 2, which supersedes the original contract, the parties agree to release and discharge each other from all manner of action and actions, caused and causes of action, claims, debts, sums of money, interest, accounts, costs, extension of time, damages, liabilities, proceeding, or suits, both in law and in equity, of whatever kind or nature arising both present and future, and from any events that occurred on or before the date of signing of this contract, addendum whether notified or not, whether or not known to the parties, including in relation to matters that could not with reasonable diligence have been discovered prior to the date of signing of this contract. Imagine that. Everything. So if you find something new that is defective, they're not liable for that. This is a criminal offense.
Incredible.
This is a criminal offense, Madam Speaker. And these are the things, as a government, we were saddled with. I wanted to show the state of the energy sector, but I couldn't. It would be remiss of me as the leader of government business in the Senate not to speak about the OS contract. I had a big speech here on rural development and local government reform, Although I'll get it next time. Okay? But I want the country to know, in closing, Madam Speaker, Madam President, is that we are in a new normal. And a new normal may be cliche, but it is a fundamental change in our circumstances as a country. Trinidad and Tobago, I ask you to wake up. Madam President, I thank you.
Senator Ameen.
Madam President, I thank you for the opportunity to contribute in this debate on the bill entitled An Act to Vary the Appropriation of the Sum Issue, of which was authorized by the Appropriation, the Financial Year 2016 Act, as laid by the Minister of Finance. In my contribution, I intend to address some more of the myths and truths on the Trinidad and Tobago's economy, some of the untruths told by this government in this bill and in general, some of the items mentioned by the Honorable Minister of Finance as he identified a way forward. And in my contribution, I intend to compare the people-centered development of the People's Partnership Government versus the punishment that this PNM government is inflicting on the citizens of this country. Madam President, I noted that the Minister of Finance, he was very somber in his delivery. He usually comes to this place with a lot of campaign rhetoric. And it continued, the campaign rhetoric of the government, present government, continued in the first sitting, which was the budget, the reading of the budget. And today I saw a little less of the political rhetoric from him. And perhaps it is because as time wears on, he is perhaps now deciding to get down to work. And ironically, many of the measures that the Minister of Finance pointed out earlier could have come and very well were listed in the People's Partnership Manifesto. And he seems to be only now coming around. So, Madam President, I want to mention a couple of the myths that he has continued and other members of government have continued to say in the Parliament, in both houses, as well as in the public domain, even though the facts are different. The campaign is over. Trinidad and Tobago, the citizens of this country, are tired of the rhetoric. They are tired of the rubber talk. It is time to get down to the business of running the country. This government continues to tell the population that the People's Partnership Government busts the Treasury. Madam President, one of the things that they often indicate is that there was a $32 billion overdraft. And the fact is that they mention that, but they do not mention the credits and give a proper balance and a true picture to the people of this country. When the money is in other accounts, and in fact some members do mention it in between when they are speaking the truth, and then they divert to the PNM rhetoric, and they continue to give the half-truths. When the former Minister of Finance held a meeting to hand over, so to speak, to the present Minister of Finance, I am sure part of the discussions, if he was interested in the truth, Madam President, would have included the facts on what the overdraft was. In the net overdraft, Madam President, was $9 million. It was mentioned $9 billion. That was mentioned by members opposite.
Could I please ask for everyone to listen to Senator Ameen in silence? Thank you.
Thank you, Madam President. It was mentioned by members opposite themselves that the net overdraft was $9 billion. And the Minister of Finance himself also indicated when he opened that the income from taxation and other places to the government usually comes in at the end of the financial year. He mentioned some lean months such as May and June. But at the end of the financial year, the partnership would have ensured that there was sufficient revenue to cover the overdraft. And the present Minister of Finance, in his budget at the beginning of this government terms, seems to have refused to credit this revenue to the 2016 accounts. And I wonder if this is an attempt to deliberately mislead the population, to create the impression as they continue their campaign rhetoric that the People's Partnership busts the Treasury. Earlier, Senator Hadeed was reprimanded for indicating that the members on the opposite side, and particularly the Minister of Finance, was misleading and telling untruths. And that is because, and those rules are in place because members are expected to tell the truth here. But if my truth is that someone else is telling a lie, what am I to say? And so I will try to continue my contribution by raising more instances where the complete truth was not told without accusing the members of anything unparliamentary. But if the shoe fits, Madam President, I'm sorry, they have to wear it. The nation is looking on, and the nation often sees through the untruths wherever they are told in the public domain. And if the Minister of Finance would truthfully include the revenue that would have come in at the end of the quarter, the last quarter of the financial year, he would have accounted for incoming cash flow from taxes to the tune of $6.5 billion. He mentioned today income from the IPO of $1.5 billion. He should have mentioned the income from the TGU, which was $4 billion, and income from loans, which was $1 billion. A total, Madam President, of $13 billion, which would have covered the overdraft, the net overdraft of $9 billion, and left you with a credit of $4 billion. Madam President, I want to say here on record that the overdraft in 2010, when the People's Partnership came into government, was $16 billion, left by the government, the PNM government, that included the present Minister of Finance. Madam President, I want to continue with another myth that is being circulated and being perpetrated by this PNM government, that the People's Partnership wasted billions of dollars. You know, Madam President, the list of projects that the PNM government ran over budget and over the estimated time, and the wastage caused to this country in the time that they were in office, leaves the nation ashamed of their track record. I want to also tell you, Madam President, that the achievements of the People's Partnership, the things that the partnership government spent money on, the things that they call wastage, includes the San Fernando Teaching Hospital. Does that include the MTES headquarters, the Ministry of Tertiary Education and Skills Training headquarters in Chaguanas? And is it that simply because these developments were outside of Port of Spain that they don't receive the endorsement of this People's Partnership government? The things that the People's Partnership government spent monies on were not in high-rise buildings. They were not in projects that had value only in one part of the country, but in every part of Trinidad and Tobago, where every single citizen was able to benefit. I heard the Minister of Local Government, of all things, Minister of Local Government, criticizing the former People's Partnership government for building box drains. It is unfortunate, Madam President, and it seems to me that he is using that as his excuse for not doing any projects for the 7 months that he has been minister. And to hear a man like him who often speaks with passion about rural communities, he reminds us almost in every sitting that he's a Mayaro boy. I wonder if he could honestly in his heart, he doesn't have to tell us here because we want the truth. I wonder if in his heart, he could point into things in Mayaro developed by this People's Partnership government that has tremendously improved the lives of the people of your hometown in Mayaro. The approach of the former government, the former people, the PNM's government, and the manner in which they treated the Beach High School speaks volumes for their approach to development that has an impact on people outside of Port of Spain. For the entire term of the people of the PNM's term in office, and under the former administration, the Beach High School remained closed. And the children of that area had to travel for many miles to attend school. And it was when the People's Partnership came back in government that the children of Beach were able to attend the Beach High School. And there's nothing wrong with it. And in fact, it is almost 5 years since that school is operating. And the children continue to operate there. There are no faults as accused by the former government. And gas leaks. As the excuses that they had given us at that time. To the extent where those children were labeled parrots and doing. I wonder who said that. I ask the question today, Madam President, is it the intention of this government to create another Beach High School out of the Couva Children's Hospital? The Couva Children's Hospital is fully equipped. It does not have staff. How many unemployed doctors are there in Trinidad and Tobago? None. How many trained nurses are waiting to be employed in this country? They ask the Association of Medical Professionals, and they will share the information. Because I realize that the government seems to be short on a lot of information that is in the public domain. They don't seem to know that there are people who studied nursing and are begging for jobs, who are waiting to be employed, who they can engage. They don't know that, and that is in the public domain because they are not connected with the people of this country. In a similar manner, earlier, my colleague Senator Hadeed referred to the Minister of Finance's response when he was asked in a previous sitting about whether he was aware that there was a black market where foreign exchange and US dollars in particular was concerned. His very short answer was no. And that approach, that arrogance, Madam President, will do nothing for this country. And it again shows how disconnected they are from the reality that the ordinary citizens are facing out there. There are people who go to the banks and withdraw whatever TT money they can and buy US currency on the black market for $7.50 and even as much as $8. And if he doesn't know that, I don't know what rock he lives under. Madam President, another myth that continues to circulate is that the People's Partnership engaged in squandermania, that there was a lot of spending, there was a mad rush for spending to win the elections, and so on. I want to indicate that the budgets of the People's Partnership, while in their 5 years in government, compared to the budgets of the previous government, and if you look year by year and then look at the total increase, the PNMs increased their expenditure from $15 billion in 2002 to $46 billion in 2009, an increase of 300%. In the People's Partnership term, the expenditure and the budgets went from 46 billion to 62 billion, and that was an increase of 35% over the 5 years. Madam President, that is about a 7% increase for each year of the 5-year term. And that is also similar to the rate of inflation during that period. And I know that the IMF seems to be a go-to place of advice for the present Minister of Finance. And I'm sure he would have read in one of their reports that the IMF agreed with the strategy of running deficits to get the economy back to growth. And in fact, many countries internationally who chose to take that approach in terms of managing their economies have come out quite well, as opposed to those who have opted to use austerity measures. Madam President, I want to go to another myth. This minister and the government continues to say that the People's Partnership left billions in debt. They speak about the acquiring of the naval vessels. They speak about the hospitals, the many schools that were built. And I want to say that, government is a thing that continues. When the term of one government ends, there must be some continuity in the country. And you must weigh in whether you are spending, whether you are borrowing to spend any investment against the results. I want to quote the commanding officer of the Coast Guard in March, in the Express in March, in an article, indicated that there was an 800% increase in drugs intercepted because of the naval vessels acquired by the People's Partnership government. Somehow they can mention the things that the partnership would have spent monies on and label them as bad debts. But somehow the bad debts that the PNM left slips out of their mind. CLICO, $20 billion. VAT, $4 billion. Contractors were owed $5 billion. All of these are debts that the partnership would have met when they came into office in 2010 and would have had to manage in addition to all the other challenges that came during its term. I noticed that the minister, one of the members of opposite, spoke about the highway, the OS highway. Madam President, for years, anything past the lighthouse, and worse yet past Grand Bazaar, didn't exist in the minds of some people. Madam President, the highway to Point 14 should have started many decades ago. The people of South Trinidad have been very patient with successive governments, and it was only when the People's Partnership came into office that the highway to Point 14 became a reality, and it should be completed. And I listen in awe when I hear members opposite indicate that the highway, should not have been done, and so on, the last speaker also spoke, and the truth is that the planning of the highway, a lot of the establishment of budgets and so on were done during the time that the PNM held office, be honest. And it continued, and the People's Partnership ensured that it was implemented. But a lot of the planning took place under the PNM government. To the extent where it is now in the public domain, Madam President, that NIDCO.
Senator Ameen, do you have a long way to go? You still have 18 minutes. Will you be availing yourself of the 18 minutes?
Come back after.
Okay. So at this time, members, we will suspend the sitting for tea, and we will return here at 5 p.m. So this sitting is suspended until 5 p.m.
Follow the Parliament of Trinidad and Tobago on Twitter. Our call sign is @TTParliament. This is the Parliament Channel and Parliament Radio 105.5 FM. You're viewing the Parliament Channel 11, also broadcasting on 105.5 FM.
The Commonwealth is a voluntary association of 54 independent states, working together towards shared goals of democracy, development, and peace. Member countries span 6 continents and oceans, from Africa to Asia, the Americas, the Caribbean, Europe, and the South Pacific. The Commonwealth is seen as a special family, a family of nations.
Barbados is a sovereign island country in the Lesser Antilles. Outside of the main hurricane belt, it lies between the Caribbean Sea and the North Atlantic Ocean, northeast of Venezuela. A large area of Barbados is circled by coral reefs. The west coast of coral shore beaches mesmerizes visitors with an expanse of white sand and calm turquoise waters. While on the wild Atlantic east coast, the lively surf pounds the rocky shore. Mostly flat, Barbados has a rolling terrain of limestone hills, lush flora and fauna, and a vast array of caves and underground lakes. Some historians claim that the original name for Barbados by the indigenous people was Ichirugunaim, with a possible translation of red land with white teeth. The origin for the later name Barbados is unclear, but according to traditional folklore it means bearded ones, and may relate to the island's bearded fig trees with aerial roots. In the late 16th and 17th centuries, the Spanish and Portuguese briefly visited Barbados. However, it was the British who established lasting settlements there. Captained by John Powell, the first English ship arrived in Barbados in 1625. By 1627, the first settlement began in what is now Whole Town. From the arrival of the first English settlers in 1627 until independence in 1966, Barbados was under uninterrupted British governance. During the early years, the majority of the population was white and male, with few African slaves. The cultivation of tobacco, cotton, ginger, and indigo was handled mainly by European indentured labor until the introduction of the sugar industry in the 1640s. Sugarcane completely transformed the society and economy. Indeed, the sugarcane industry in Barbados grew to become one of the largest in the world. By 1660, Barbados generated more trade than all the other English colonies combined. This continued until 1713, when it was eventually surpassed by larger islands such as Jamaica. As the Barbados economy grew, the island developed a large measure of local autonomy.
I think the success of the economy meant the success of the planters, meant the success of the ruling oligarchy. That gave them a capacity to have influence in Britain itself, political influence, and therefore, in a sense, to say this was our place. That is demonstrated in the political complex of Britain itself. For instance, the Cromwellian episode, where Cromwell took over, from the Charles I and so on. The Barbadian planters actually resisted the Cromwellian regime, and Cromwell had to send naval forces out to Barbados, and there was a shootout off Oistins. And Barbados made a declaration in which the language in that declaration, some people say, informed the language of the Declaration of Independence of the American colonies.
Barbados has one of the oldest constitutions in the Commonwealth. The office of governor and the council were introduced in 1627, and a House of Assembly was constituted in 1639.
What was unbroken in Barbados was a parliament and an assembly. But these early assemblies, coming out of the 17th century and so on, would have been with a very limited number of people voting for them, and that continued right into the 19th century. Very few people up to the beginning of the 20th century. Very few people who were voting because there would have been property franchise and both in relation to who could go into parliament and who could vote. So a very small number of people then were actually involved in voting and having representation. So representative government in that sense was very limited. We started to break through with some expansion of the franchise immediately after emancipation, and that allowed for the first non-white Barbadian to enter parliament, which was Samuel Jackman Prescott in 1841.
For decades, politics in Barbados was dominated by the plantation owners and merchants of British descent.
Now, Barbados had the old representative system, and it normally had strong influence over the Windward Islands and Tobago. And it was felt that the administration would be efficient, more efficient, if Barbados could be the headquarters with the governor of Barbados and the Windward Islands, and you have a crown colony government system. And they sent out the Irishman John Pope Pavilion Hennessy as the governor to implement this policy. And he was a very skilled troubleshooter. He came out and he was actually a very popular governor at first, in his first moments in presence in Barbados. And then he started his campaign for crown colony government. And the interest and consciousness was so keen that they picked it up immediately that he was where he was going. And they started to resist him, even to the extent of public meetings, holding public meetings and so on, to say that the governor was trying to take away their rights as Englishmen, and their right to rule the colony, and that they understood the colony better than the Englishmen anyhow.
A rebellion ensued between the planters and the masses.
So in fact, this was a rebellion that was going on with the governor's name as a slogan to mobilize people on behalf of the governor, on behalf of crown colony government. And it was resisted then by the planters, and the revolt became quite widespread and severe. And the governor eventually panicked, because he thought that the rebels would move to Bridgetown and sack Bridgetown. Very traditionally in Barbados, when rebellions like that took place, they will run to St. Anne's Fort, which is up the road, the garrison. They will go there, or also in Carlisle Bay. going ships off Carlisle Bay, and hope that the militia and the army could take care of the rebellion. And that is more or less what was happening. And the military eventually had to be committed. The planter militia was very